This episode of New Politics was released on the 5th of October, 2024, and produced on the lands of the Wangal and Gadigal people.
Welcome to New Politics. In this episode, the Labor government has delivered a second surplus, but not everyone is happy about this. The Queensland election campaign is up and running. There's a new special envoy for Islamophobia, but no one knows who it is. And the politics of Lebanon and national security getting a workout in Australia. I'm Eddie Djokovic, editor of New Politics.
I'm David Lewis, poet laureate.
And just our regular message, listen in, share, subscribe and support New Politics at Patreon and Substack, or you can donate at our website at newpolitics.com.au. And of course, all of this is a good way to support independent journalism.
Don't push me, cause I'm close to the edge. I'm trying not to lose my head. It's like a jungle sometimes, it makes me wonder how I keep from going under.
The federal government has delivered its second surplus in a row, and as usual it's brought about a huge debate about what it means for the economy and what it means for the credentials of the Treasurer, Jim Chalmers.
This is a powerful demonstration of our responsible economic management. Responsible economic management is a defining feature of the Albanese Labor government. These are the first consecutive surpluses in almost 2 decades. That $172 billion turnaround in just 2 years is the biggest nominal improvement in the budget in a parliamentary term ever. And it wouldn't have happened without our responsible economic management. It wouldn't have happened without our spending restraint, without our savings, and it wouldn't have happened without the way that we've taken the right economic and fiscal decisions for the right economic and fiscal reasons.
This year the surplus is $15.8 billion. Last year it was $6.4 billion, and despite not being able to deliver a surplus during their 9 years in office between 2013 and 2022, and despite being absolutely hopeless economic managers, the Shadow Treasurer Angus Taylor believes that this is all because of the good work of the Liberal Party, even though they were booted out of office over 2 years ago. And as we've always pointed out, the mainstream media always claims that a surplus when the Liberal Party is in government, well, that's very good news and because of their excellent economic management. When Labor is in government, well, it's just very lucky. And if there's a debt when the Liberal Party's in office, well, that's due to some really, really bad luck and external circumstances. And a debt for the Labor government is always depicted as typical of them being unable to manage the economy. And the other factor is that a surplus or a deficit is neither good nor bad in itself. It just has to be suitable for the times. And the bigger issue is what that total amount of the government spending of $734 billion is being spent on, and whether it's being spent in the right areas. And I'm not too sure if it is.
It's always the question, is a surplus more desirable than looking after the populace in the ways the populace needs to be looked after? Having a bit of extra money is okay, but again, a lot of it is, there's still a massive debt. Now, Labor has cut this debt back a fair bit, but we're still in debt. We still have things that don't obviously have a monetary return. Things like public service wages do have a good return in terms of the knowledge and the work done, but you don't get money back from that necessarily. To go all neoliberal there for a second, you have maintenance and things like that. We have this massive hole, and I've mentioned this I think every week, but AUKUS, that's just money down the drain. There's no return on that at all. The promised submarines actually don't have to happen. The submarines will only come if they are surplus to US requirements. We have a housing crisis everywhere, but mostly in our major cities. And the crisis is a weird crisis in that how you would fix the boom that's heading towards a bust is by building more houses to create a long-term oversupply, which would bring houses down. However, we have so many vacant houses. Building more houses isn't going to solve the problem. It's just going to keep the problem where it is at best. So we need tax reform. We need to fix the NDIS. We need to fix Medicare desperately. We need to fix the university system. Should Treasurer Chalmers have gone for a surplus? Now, politically, it was smart. The press, as you rightly said, hammer Labor if they brought in $1 deficit, if they balanced the books equally, they'd be seen as irresponsible in the press. My view is that our most successful leaders of the last few years have ignored the mainstream press. Dan Andrews ignored the mainstream press. And I know that for some of you, he blotted his copybook with his support of Israel, but he was a very electorally successful premier. Bob Carr, another very electorally successful premier, ignored the mainstream press. He didn't give interviews to the people who he was, inverted commas, supposed to give interviews to. He just delivered what he saw and what his government saw as good outcomes, and the public tended to agree. I suspect, and we'll be getting back to this, that the same type of tactic might work for Stephen Miles in Queensland.
Surpluses and deficits, well, they're always going to be political, and a Labor government just always needs to keep proving itself economically, as you refer to, again and again and again and again, and then some more. And the Liberal Party, well, they, of course, just seem to be able to do whatever they want without any repercussions at all. But, I'm not saying anything new. This has been the case in Australia for a long, long time. And this might have been part of Labor's thinking with all of this, get a surplus happening, not just for 1 year, but for 2 years. That will shut everyone up about this idea of superior economic management. I don't think it will. The media just moves on to other things to complain about. So that's the political part of it, but the economic part of it is that it helps reduce inflation, takes some government spending out of the economy. And inflation and unchecked consumerism is generally the biggest problem in economic terms. And it does allow the government to put out that message of disciplined spending, and that was a message coming from the Finance Minister, Katie Gallagher. And government debt has gone down from $517 billion in May 2022 down to $491 billion. And this part of it is a good political story to tell and get some immunity from the political attacks that they usually get on the economy. But whether they're up to having the ability to effectively push this message out to the electorate, I think that's a different issue.
Yeah, Labor has the problem, and I'm certainly not the first nor the only person to say this. Ronnie Salt, the independent journalist, said it. Nikki Sava recently said it. Labor has a communication problem. It can't seem to break through with good messaging. I think the answer is, and I don't think I'm the first one to say this either, but that they just ignore the mass media altogether, or the mainstream media altogether, and go onto social media and tell their story, which is really what Kevin Rudd did in 2007. He avoided mainstream media as much as he could and ran the Kevin 07 campaign on social media. We're now 15 years more entrenched with social media, so those types of tactics, you'd have to change them, of course. But those types of tactics, I think, work extremely well. The big voting bloc coming through is not the baby boomer generation who are starting to hit late 70s. In the next election, the oldest ones will be 80. It's not Gen X, who were never a big section of the voting population anyway. It is millennials and Generation Z. Now, of course, I've always been problematic with this type of generational analysis. Like any group you can point to, we don't have a uniformity of ideas. We have a diversity of ideas that stretch along the political and social and cultural divides. But we can say that the flagging mainstream TV ratings is because younger people tend not to watch broadcast television. Again, not all of them. Some do and love it, and that's fine, and I'm, no judgment. The competition which Rupert Murdoch fought so hard against, streaming and alternate forms of information, is slowly killing the mainstream. Some mainstream media outlets have done well in embracing it, others just don't know what to do. Channel 7 seems to have gone to, well, if all we can get is baby boomers, that will be our programming. Channel 10 is still trying to keep younger people engaged. That they are failing at that is not really their fault. I don't think they can succeed at it anymore.
Well, David, you and I are obviously not Generation Z, but we do have children that are part of Generation Z, so we're absolute experts in this area. We absolutely know what we are talking about. But there have been a lot of suggestions about what good is having a surplus, and this is coming from a lot of Gen Z people as well. What is the point of having a surplus when there's cost of living issues, there's housing issues, job seeker payments haven't been raised to the poverty level yet, and these are all very valid questions, and whether or not there's a surplus or a budget, I don't think that's really the issue. I think it gets back to that bigger question of what are we spending the other $734 billion that the government allocated last year? What's that being spent on? And there's negative gearing benefits, capital gains tax, share franking credit benefits, private schools, private health, our good old favourite, the AUKUS agreement, which you mentioned before, that's $10 billion per year for the next 40 years or so, and that just seems to be an expensive military insurance scheme, a super profits tax. And if they don't want to do that, well, maybe a super profits tax on some of the biggest miners. So you're reducing the impact of that. That would rake in billions of dollars. And I'm not suggesting that you cut all of these programs that I've just mentioned, because there might be a lot of unintended economic and political consequences, but you shave them back. Forget about the surplus. That's being done for, in my opinion, for good economic reasons. It's all of these other spending areas that we should be really concerned about, and we should be spending more of that money on issues that are in the public interest.
I think it'd be interesting to see what people want the money spent on. I'm pretty sure there'd be some people who think, yes, we need a strong defence force and we need our borders closed. But why do they think that? There are other people who think, yes, we need a public health system that used to be one of the best in the world but is now fading down.
But my point is that having a surplus doesn't necessarily mean that you're a good treasurer or a good economic manager, but that's how the media tries to interpret all of this. But that's a pretty simplistic and shallow understanding of economics. The key issue is how you're managing the main bulk of that $734 billion of government spending, and whether you're spending that well enough on most of the community and the people that need it the most. And I just don't think that the government is doing that. Raising the rate of JobKeeper or having a high-quality Medicare system, well, that shouldn't depend on whether we have a surplus or not, because if there isn't a surplus, well, all of those essential items would be the first ones to be cut back. So good economic management is the big picture of economics, like the budget, the spending, what we're spending that money on, making sure debt is managed and doesn't get out of control, interest rates, managing the Reserve Bank and how that Reserve Bank is constituted. I think it's a combination of all of these different issues.
I would argue the general rule is, while things are good, you build the surplus and you spend it when things go bad, which is what the Rudd government did. Wayne Swan and Paul Keating, I think, were the only two treasurers to win Finance Minister of the Year from Money magazine. They were able to acknowledge how valuable both Keating were and Swan was to finance in Australia, or to the economy in Australia. Again, the Reserve Bank and Treasury shouldn't be made up of privileged, wealthy people only. They should be made up of people from ACOS, student representatives, single mothers, unemployed people, people on disability allowances, people struggling with a mortgage in Sydney or Melbourne's West, some economic experts. We'd get probably a much better and a much more informed response to economic issues than having corporate people who don't have to worry about, will we make next month's mortgage payments? Can I afford to pay the electricity bill? And this is the types of people who should be at least advising Treasury. The neo-libs have had their go. They've botched their go, and it's time to get rid of them.
Queensland election campaigns are unlike anything else, and I can't wait to get into it. Now's not the time to change course and move away from that, but all elections are about the future, and Queenslanders are looking for who has the best plans to support them with their cost of living right now, as well as a plan for the state's future on housing, on the economy, on healthcare, and on delivering cleaner, cheaper energy.
The Queensland election campaign has commenced, and it started off with the Premier Stephen Miles catching a bus to see the Governor to issue the election writ and dissolve Parliament. The Labor government has been in office since 2015 and for 30 of the past 35 years since 1989. The Liberal National Party is way ahead in the opinion polls at the moment and is strongly favoured to win. But it's not over until it's over, David. The election will be held on October the 26th, so there's still some time to go with this, but it also might be a case of short memories, because the last time the LNP was in government between 2012 and 2015, they were the worst government in the history of Federation. They severely cut and damaged the public service. The government led by Campbell Newman was incompetent, there was infighting, and the LNP is keeping that very well hidden in this election campaign so far. The LNP leader, David Crisafulli, is doing his best to let people know that it won't be anything like the Newman government, but the signs are that it will be exactly the same as the Newman government. Most of the people who were part of that government are still there in Parliament, and if they do manage to win the Queensland election and form government, well, it's probably going to be more of the same.
It's clearly going to be more of the same. Crisafulli was a minister in the Newman government. He's probably you hope he would have learnt some stuff, not in terms of making the policies any better, but in selling the policies and in unifying the party and all the stuff that was wrong with the Newman government. I can't help but feel, though, that Miles is going to get back in. I think partly he's not really engaging with the mainstream media, but he's running a very competent social media campaign. I nearly said effective, but we won't know if it's effective till the election. I also suspect that Labor parties that run on a progressive policy tend to win. The current federal Labor government ran on a progressive policy. The New South Wales State Labor won on a progressive policy. Victoria ran on progressive policy. That there were problems in the opposition helped as well, but voters didn't seem to be very perturbed by progressive policies from a Labor government. And Stephen Miles has bought in 50-cent fares in Brisbane. He's got doctors in 50 public schools all around the state on call, ready to look after serious issues. It's quite effective in his spending. And I think even Conservative voters recognise that a Labor Party that follows Labor policies is a much more effective Labor Party than one that just tries to ape the Liberal Party. Because why would you vote for Labor if they're just going to do the same as the people you're voting against? That was a very long-winded way of saying that I agree with you there and that I don't think it's over till it's over. I'm not quite prepared to call the election in his favour, but I am going to say I don't think it'll be a surprise win if he wins.
And I don't want to boost the hopes of our Labor listeners too much, but this Queensland election for me has got a 2019 federal election feel to it, where Labor was expected to win that election but had Bill Shorten as the leader. And even though focus group after focus group kept on telling them that there was a public image problem with Bill Shorten and that they weren't going to vote for him, the Labor Party did nothing at all to change that. And I realise that that's all superficial and facile. People should vote on policies, not on the personalities, but that's just how politics is. And I've got a similar feeling about David Crisafulli as well. And I think that he's got a terrible public persona. He just looks weak and small. He looks like a little kid, a little bit like Bill Shorten. And again, this is all very superficial and facile, but these are some of the issues that people vote on. And I think Stephen Miles has been running a good campaign so far, as you mentioned, through social media, but whether that's enough to turn things around in less than 4 weeks, it has happened before in Australian elections. It's hard to see that happening, but you just never know in Australian politics.
We're in an odd period where Crisafulli could win, and there's a sense in which it's going to be Brisbane versus the rest of the state, which it always is, really. Brisbane and surrounds, Gold Coast, Sunshine Coast, versus Central and Far North Queensland. We won't really have any idea till the results start coming through on the Saturday night. But it's a fascinating campaign and an important campaign.
And on that point, a few of our audience members have asked us, well, how will the Queensland election affect federal politics? And I think if we look at what is expected to happen, the Liberal National Party wins and David Crisafulli becomes the Premier. I think the magnitude of that win will influence what the federal government does about the next federal election when it decides to call that. If the swing against is not severe for the Labor Party, well, they might be tempted to hold an election sooner rather than later. And that's similar to what happened in 1993 when Western Australia had a state election. The WA Labor government lost, and the Prime Minister at the time, Paul Keating, looked at that and thought, well, we lost that election, but the swing against the Labor Party wasn't as bad as I thought it was going to be. And he called the federal election the day after and went on to win that election. But if there's an absolute shellacking for the Queensland Labor, well, Anthony Albanese will probably think, well, that's no good. Things are worse in Queensland than I thought they might have been. Let's wait to see if David Crisafulli makes some terrible decisions in the first 4 or 5 months in office. Then we'll cash in on that and hold the election in May next year. Now, that doesn't involve any great thinking on my behalf. I think that the election was always going to be held in May next year, the federal election, and many people are suggesting that as well. But sometimes there's events in politics that changes your mind about what could happen, especially if you're the Prime Minister, and this could be one of those events.
And we've pointed this out before. Queensland is a odd state in that superficially it looks like it's a very conservative state, and federally it certainly suggests that. But at a state level, it's had more Labor governments over its whole history. And since the ousting of the Bjelke-Petersen government, it's been far more Labor than Liberal. So Queensland isn't a laid-down misère for either side. No state is really. But Queensland would be the one where you think, they will always go for the non-Labor side. And the other thing too is that they only have the one House of Parliament. So sometimes the anger gets expressed in the upper house. We don't have that analytical tool in Queensland to sort of say, well, maybe they'll keep the government in but punish them in the upper house. That just can't happen. So again, we just have to see.
This is New Politics with Eddie Djokovic and David Lewis, one of Australia's top 10 podcasts on Australian politics and news commentary. You can also find us at newpolitics.com.au, and you can also support us through Patreon and Substack.
The special envoy to combat Islamophobia has been appointed, but there was no media conference by the Prime Minister, there was no fanfare. It wasn't really big news. You had to go searching online to find it, and it was like the government just didn't want anyone to know about this. The new special envoy is Aftab Malik. No one really knows who he is. He hasn't got much of a connection with the Islamic community in Australia. He has been working within the New South Wales Premier's Department for almost a decade, and before that he worked on a few counter-terrorism programs in the United Kingdom. And this follows on from the appointment of a special envoy to combat anti-Semitism. Gillian Siegel was appointed 3 months ago, and there have been claims that the government took such a long time to make the appointment because nobody from the Islamic community wanted to take on the job. Well, that's not correct. It's because the government couldn't find anyone who was acceptable to the Israeli community in Australia. And Aftab Malik fits the bill. He's not really from the Islamic community. He's worked on anti-terror programs. He seems quite inoffensive, and he probably won't be given much to do anyway. The Australian Federation of Islamic Councils, well, they've welcomed the appointment, and so they should. At least the positions now exist for a person of Jewish background and a person of an Islamic background, but we can probably predict what's going to happen here. The anti-Semitism envoy will probably grab all the attention, and the anti-Islamophobia envoy will be neglected and probably forgotten about.
And be shown to be a waste of taxpayers' money. And the Anti-Discrimination Board already does this work. Also, there seems to be an extremely broad definition of anti-Semitism and a fairly narrow definition of anti-Islam. I'm not going to critique either appointment to the job. I think we can only see how they do once we start to see what they're doing. And I haven't seen any work from the anti-Semitic that's notable. Sometimes these dud jobs can be made into something really useful and special. Sometimes, of course, they're just seat warmers and, there's a nice offer and people working their guts out and all of that, and nothing happens.
Well, if there was a special envoy for podcasting set up, well, I'd gladly take up that job.
Oh, for sure. You'd probably make something of it. I've struggled to see the point of either role when we have the Anti-Discrimination Board, when we have laws protecting, and we should have laws protecting people from unwarranted and racist abuse. What we need to really look at is, instead of particular groups, if you're an Australian or if you're in Australia, you get treated the same as everybody else, equitably. Everyone is equal in front of the law. You should be able to walk down the street without undue attention from the police. You should be able to get a taxi or an Uber without the way you're dressed changing things. You should be able to speak in the language most comfortable to you in a public place. If you break the law, that's a different thing. But what law do you break, and how are you treated for it?
But generally, I don't think that there's really too much to see here. These types of positions are window dressing and serve no real purpose, as you alluded to, David. And it's a little bit like Tony Abbott and Barnaby Joyce. They were made special envoys in 2015 for no good reason other than to get a wad of cash for losing their jobs. Gillian Siegel has been to the World Jewish Conference in Argentina, and that's all there is on the public record. And just like with Barnaby Joyce and Tony Abbott, there's no published reports or anything that the public can view, and there probably never will be. And these positions are obviously political and created for consumption by the electorate. And I think that both of these positions also speak to the Israel lobby groups in Australia. And if these positions were all about social cohesion, as the federal government keeps going on about, well, Anthony Albanese would have announced these positions at the same media conference at the same time, get the two of them to be in the same room and shake hands. Now, it wouldn't have had the same effect as the handshake between Yasser Arafat and Yitzhak Rabin in 1995, but it certainly would have helped.
It does feel that both of these positions were brought in under some kind of pressure from someone. And it seems to...
Well, they also just came out of the blue.
And they came out of the blue, particularly after an unsuccessful referendum on trying to improve things for Indigenous people. I'm holding back till we see some more results. I'll let them both settle into the job. And she's been overseas, as you said, but there might be more happening behind the scenes that we don't know about. And so I'm quite prepared to give both office holders the benefit of the doubt and see what their successes are in 6 months or so.
Israel has begun its ground offensive into the south. A short while ago, Israeli forces fired flares into the night sky amid heavy shelling. Israeli soldiers and military vehicles have been amassing along the border over the past several hours. Flares are commonly used to signal troops on the ground and light their path, as well as to confirm targets. Throughout Monday, Israeli airstrikes continue to target southern Lebanon. Intense bombing was seen in Marjayoun. By night, airstrikes hit the area of Tyre near the coast. Hezbollah says it's fighting back with shelling and rocket attacks. Several Israeli airstrikes have hit the southern suburbs of Beirut. A series of loud explosions were heard across the city just after midnight. Those attacks came shortly after Israeli forces repeated their same tactic of issuing chaotic evacuation orders that we have seen in Gaza.
Not content with invading, occupying and razing Palestine, the Israel Defence Forces have invaded Lebanon and continued with their actions over there as well. Iran has retaliated with a missile attack into Israel, and predictably, the mainstream media in Australia and most of the Western world has cast Iran and Lebanon as the villains, even though Israel is the aggressor in this case. Since October the 7th last year, at least 42,000 Palestinians have been killed, possibly up to 200,000, and at least 2,000 people in Lebanon, while there have been 1,700 Israelis killed. And it should never be a contest between who suffered the most casualties, but just to give some context, 99% of all of these people have been killed by Israeli Defence Forces and settler paramilitaries, and 1% have been killed by Hamas, Hezbollah and Iran. So it's pretty clear in my opinion who the real terrorists are in this situation. And of course this is being played out politically in Australia with great predictability. Peter Dutton is getting as much political mileage out of this as possible. He's got no interest in social cohesion and will say whatever he needs to say to create division.
I just think every reasonable Australian at the moment is looking to their Prime Minister for leadership, and what they're seeing is weakness. And our Prime Minister should stand up, as the British Prime Minister has, as President Biden has, as Prime Minister Trudeau has, to condemn the actions of Hezbollah and the proposal that the United States has that Australia has walked away from to try and provide some support and stability in the north of Israel on the border. Why the Prime Minister has rejected that, I don't know. It seems to me that the Prime Minister and Penny Wong at the moment are making decisions that are of political benefit to them domestically, but which are not in our national interest. And I think they should stand condemned for that, and I think most Australians would be of that same view.
And Bridget McKenzie, who has moved on as the instigator of the Sports Rorts affair and has become the National Party's resident expert on Middle East politics, she's also offered her words of wisdom.
Well, I support upholding the UN's resolution to actually get Hezbollah out from the northern border of Israel, for them to actually move in and move Hezbollah out, rather than see day in, day out those communities not only under missile attack. We've got in excess of 70,000 Israelis displaced. Well, that's the UN resolution. We either uphold international law or we don't. We can't pick and choose which bits we want depending on what's happening in Western Sydney.
And yes, Bridget, that is absolutely true. We must follow UN resolutions, but it's the state of Israel that has not followed any United Nations resolutions at all. And not to be outdone, the Home Affairs Minister, Tony Burke, has announced that anyone holding a Hezbollah flag or inciting discord will have their visa cancelled.
I've got very strong views against hate speech and hate symbols, very strong views. And I don't want the anger and hatred from around the world being imported into Australia. And so, as far as I'm concerned, it doesn't matter which side of a conflict you're on. If you're involved in inciting discord and hatred in Australia, then I want to have a look, and I ask the department to prepare a brief for me so I can consider whether the visa should be cancelled.
So this falls down predictable lines where the Liberal and National parties ramp up all of this maliciously, and the government hasn't got time for a history lesson or explain the context of what's going on in the Middle East. So ethics and morality just fly out the window. It's just easier to say that you more or less agree with what Peter Dutton is saying and join in the stampede to diminish the Islamic and Arab communities even further in Australia.
It's a horrible thing. I've mentioned before that the Lebanese community, the vast majority of people here have become highly valuable and valued members of Australian society. I live in a fairly strong Lebanese community. I'm not Lebanese myself, but my neighbours are, my friends are. And the vast majority are wonderful, law-abiding citizens who have made Australia a better place in the little way that individuals can. That the government would try and sow division amongst a fairly sizable population of Australia defeats me. Now, I know that they're trying to call it Hezbollah, and Hezbollah is a problematic organisation, but it's an organisation that has no influence in Australia. And at some point, we might need to talk about Hezbollah's challenges for a secular liberal democracy, but it doesn't mean they deserve to be bombed. It doesn't mean that innocent people who happen to be standing next to somebody deserve to be bombed. It's quite extraordinary that we've got to this. And we're even to the point where what is anti-Jewish? Now, before I say anything else, you should be able to identify as a Jewish person in Australia. You should be able to follow or not the rituals and religious rites of Judaism and identify unhindered and unbothered by the rest of the world. We should all be equal in the law and in society. But what defeats me is when certain members of the Jewish community say that being against the state of Israel is being anti-Semitic or anti-Jewish. The highly conservative Haredi movement, for which we get people like Hasidic Jews, there are groups of sects in there that think that Israel is against the wishes of God. And they say that because ultimately it's an idol and you shouldn't worship idols. It's a bit more complex than that, but that's what it boils down to. There are many secular Jewish people or cultural Jewish people who are opposed to Zionism and the notion of Israel. Noam Chomsky, for example, used to be pro-Israel, then he went, and then he realized that from his observations that Israel was a failed state. He's not the only one, but he's a notable intellectual who has spoken out against Israel from a Jewish perspective. So I don't see how you can claim that a Jewish person being opposed to Israel, and in some cases devoted and devout Jewish people, are anti-Jewish. But this is how bullies change the language. If you're not with us 100%, you're against us. No enemies to the left in the old radical. This is how you must think and act and speak, otherwise you are not of us. And if you are not of us, you must be destroyed, damaged, or hurt in some way. And we've got to start kicking against that notion that people who make reasonable claims against governments and structures are somehow against the people who make these things up. Anti-Jewishness is awful and should be stamped out. But anti-criticism of the state or government of Israel and criticism of the niche movement of Zionism should be properly conducted.
And I think a lot of this boils down to national security issues as well in Australia. And national security is like kryptonite for the Labor Party ever since about 1998, when the Liberal government decided to ramp up issues on asylum seekers, border security and national security, and then had follow-up events with the Tampa incident in 2001 and then 9/11 in the United States, which dovetailed perfectly into all of those issues that they'd been building up for several years. I think all of this relates to that. And I am actually surprised that 26 years later, the Labor Party still hasn't worked out a tactic or a technique to push back against many of these issues that results in draconian legislation, which in most cases contravenes international human rights conventions and some of our own laws as well. And maybe that's what the tactic is, just say yes to everything and agree with the Liberal Party, whether they're the government or not. Just say yes. And this results in some really terrible and poor legislation, and marginalised communities end up becoming more marginalised, and these laws just end up backing up the cliches that the electorate already thinks when it comes to Islam and Arabs in Australia. And it's also a question about how far do we take this. I've been to quite a few of the pro-Palestine events in Sydney, and what I see is a community that is hurting quite badly and suffering quite badly from the events that are going on in the Middle East. But every event that I've been to has been peaceful. Yeah. And the only problems that I've seen have been Zionist agitators trying to rustle up the crowd. And the organisers of these events, they always tell the crowd, don't cause any trouble, because we know how this plays out in the media. But in the more recent events on the weekend, it was actually the police causing the trouble. They pepper sprayed a 13-year-old boy in Sydney who was holding up the yellow flag of Hezbollah, even though the law says that a legal offence is only created if the flag is concurrent with other threatening behaviour. So the police don't even know their own laws. And it seems that holding a yellow flag peacefully is deemed to be far more offensive than the killing of over 40,000 people. So to me, it just seems like there's a lot of things that are a bit messed up here.
Yeah, someone pointed out that what about a Nazi flag? Would you allow that to be waved? And of course, these are problematic issues with banning things. And of course, the Nazi flag, I think the vast majority of people would agree that it's an offensive and a figure of hate more so than a flag. One of the other things too is that the Hezbollah flag isn't a problem in Australia. It's a show of solidarity with people who are going through a terrible, and honestly, if you're going to have to side, who are you going to side with? The aggressor or the people being oppressed? Same with the Palestinian flag. The Palestinian flag is an established nation recognised by the United Nations. In the same way that you shouldn't be arrested for flying the Norwegian flag or the Iraqi flag or the Brazilian flag. I think that we're heading down to some very dangerous precedents that will be very hard to undo, but also create many problems down the track.
And we're not trying to promote any form of radicalisation here. We're just outlining the different standards that exist for different groups in Australia. Now, there are two stories, as there are in all cases, but we overwhelmingly hear only one side of the story, which is usually a wild distortion of the truth anyway. And that narrative that Israel is a partner for peace and that the Arab world is the enemy of peace in the Middle East is totally incorrect. Here's the Jordanian Foreign Minister, Ayman Safadi, providing a narrative that we never ever hear in Australia.
The Israeli Prime Minister came here today and said that Israel is surrounded by those who want to destroy it, an enemy. We're here, members of a Muslim Arab committee mandated by 57 Arab and Muslim countries. And I can tell you here, very unequivocally, all of us are willing to, right now, guarantee the security of Israel in the context of Israel ending the occupation and allowing for the emergence of a Palestinian state, independent state, along the efforts that we all agree. He is creating that danger because he simply does not want the two-state solution. And if he does not want the two-state solution, can you ask the Israeli officials, what is their end game? Other than just wars and wars and wars. I'm telling you, all of us in the Arab world here, we want a peace in which Israel lives in peace and security, accepted, normalized with all Arab countries in the context of ending the occupation, withdrawing from Arab territory, allowing for the emergence of an independent, sovereign Palestinian state on June 4, 1967, lines with occupied Jerusalem as capital. That is our narrative. That is, and we will guarantee Israel's security in that context. Can you ask Israelis what's their narrative other than I'm going to continue to go to war, I'm going to kill this and kill that and destroy this and this that? The amount of damage that Israeli government has done, 30 years of efforts to convince people that peace is possible, this Israeli government killed it. The amount of dehumanization, hatred, bitterness will take generations to navigate through. So ultimately the question is, we want peace. And we've laid out a plan for peace. Ask any Israeli official, what is their plan for peace? You'll get nothing because they're only thinking of the first step. We're going to go destroy Gaza, inflame the West Bank, destroy Lebanon. And after that, they have no plan. We have a plan. We have no partner for peace in Israel. There is a partner for peace in the Arab world.
Now, it's not popular to talk about these things in Australia because many people have accepted the narrative from the Australian media and from the Australian political class, and people in Australia are generally not that interested in international events unless it affects them personally. That's not a criticism, that's just the way that it is. But the actions of Israel have been disturbing. The massacres, the killing of civilians, the killing of children, and it's clearly an apartheid state. And there's also this new thing called genocide tourism, where boat operators take people off to the shore of Gaza at night time and watch the bombing of Gaza from a distance. And that to me is just really psychotic behaviour. On two levels, the boat operators deciding to make money from this venture and the people deciding to pay and go on these boats to watch a group of people being destroyed. And to me, this is the sort of society that Australian politics is supporting and doing everything it can to appease it. You know, the government and the opposition. The Australian Greens have consistently been calling this out for some time, but aside from that, people of Islamic and Arab backgrounds just don't seem to have much of a place in the Australian political system.
Yeah, it's really odd. Again, the vast majority have enriched Australia in cultural, in material, in social ways. And yet there seems to be this implicit social license that if you need to kick into someone, you can kick into the Islamic community, particularly the Middle Eastern Islamic community. The biggest Islamic nation in the world is Indonesia, right on our doorstep. We never hear any problems there, and we shouldn't. But when it comes to the Middle East, and of course the Middle East has 3 or 4 major religions dominated by Islam, and of course Islam is not there's a variety of views in Islam, from the type that they like to promote, the anti-Western, very conservative, very right-wing radical, right through to quite progressive, pro-Western, feminist thinking, and every point in between. But they stir up hate against the more right-wing radicals, even though they agree with 90% of it, who are a minority within the religion anyway. It would be like tarring Christianity with the survivalist millennial nutjobs who think that Jesus is returning imminently and waiting for the imminent collapse of society so they can go and use their guns on people, and who want to oppress the rights of women and stuff. And of course that's not all Christians, and in the same way that not all Jews are Zionists. would be a good thing for Labor to do, would be to start to change this attitude and to acknowledge the positive stuff that the Lebanese community, that the Syrian, that the Jordanian community have brought in to the country. Whether they're game to do that or not is another question though.
That's it for this episode of New Politics. Thanks for listening in. And if you'd like to support our style of journalism and commentary, please make a donation at our website at newpolitics.com.au. We don't beg, plead, beseech or gaslight you about journalism coming to an end. We just keep it very simple. If you like what we do, please send some support our way. It keeps our commitment to independent journalism ticking along. I'm Eddie Djokovic. Thanks for listening in, and it's goodbye to our listeners.
I'm David Lewis. We'll see you next time.
I have to celebrate you, baby. I have to praise you like I should.